We are live. Okay.
I think that's it.
Play is normally not that long. There we go. It's a long
Good evening and welcome to the February 14th, 2024 BAR Large Meeting at the Public Meeting Room here at 2 George Street. My name is John Robinson. I'm the chair for this evening's meeting. The other members present with me are Jay White, Luda Sobchuk, James Metters, Seton Brown. City staff president for the first time sitting in this chair is B.D. Worsham Galvin, our city architect, accompanied by Lawrence Courtney, staff architect. I guess Travis here this morning.
I'm your Frankie.
Oh, and Frankie Pinto, of course, is with us.
BARS.
On BARS administration is with us this evening. All applicants who are appearing and presenting this evening have been required to submit any documents in their presentation in advance of the meeting. We do have the option this evening of using the clicker at the podium, but you do so at your own peril. I would strongly encourage you to ask Lawrence to move to the slide to which you would like us and the public to view. All materials that have been submitted by the applicant by the required deadline and in accordance with the submittal requirements will be available to the applicant. The applicant simply needs to ask Lawrence to advance to the slide or use the clicker. Applicants, staff, and all board members should state their name and affiliation with the project when speaking. This meeting is recorded and live streamed to the City of Charleston public meeting channel on YouTube. Your appearance here is your consent to be recorded. The order of the meeting, or for each presentation actually, will be as follows. There's first an introduction and overview of each applicant's project by city staff for the benefit of the board and the public. This is followed by the applicant's presentation, which has a 10-minute time limit unless extended at the election of the chair and as requested by the applicant. This can be followed immediately by board questions to the applicant by the board staff. Any and all presenters should clearly state their name for the record. Those people being owners, architects, designers, or consultants should speak during this portion of the period of the speaking period rather than the succeeding period of public comment. The applicant's presentation is followed by public comment. All applications are part of a public meeting. Written public comments were due by noon yesterday, and to the extent that they exist, they've already been disseminated by the board. They will not be to the board. They will not be read into the record unless considered necessary by the chairman or at the request of a member of the board and accepted by the chairman. Any member of the public present with us tonight who wishes to speak in person should do so by approaching the podium and giving us their name and address for the record. Members of the public speaking are politely reminded that there's a 2-minute time limit for those remarks unless extended by the chair. This period is followed by city staff comments and recommendations. After the city staff comments or recommendations, the applicant has the opportunity to respond or clarify anything in either the public comments period and or the city staff comments and recommendations. The response time has a limit of 5 minutes. The applicant should not use the response period if they do not feel it is necessary. The response period is then followed by a board discussion and vote on each agenda item. At this point, the applicant's presentation is over, public comment is closed. The applicant may clarify any inaccurate information when recognized by the chair by raising their hand and waiting to be called upon. When a motion is made, board members will be polled by the chairperson for comments and their vote on any particular motion. The chair shall reread the motion verbatim, and the board member making the motion should correct me if I have not reread it accurately. Once a motion is in proper order and seconded, each member when voting should in turn say yay in favor or nay not in favor. The result of tonight's meeting will be posted on the city website, which is charleston-sc.gov/BAR. There are no agenda items that have been withdrawn or deferred at anyone's request. We had one public comment for 860 Larson Drive. This is a reminder to both applicants and any member of the public, whether you've been with us before or not, to please turn off cell phones and any other disruptive devices. And a further reminder to members of the public that this board is governed by certain rules and laws, which we try to keep in place for the purposes of maintaining this wonderful institution. Therefore, comments such related to zoning, parking, traffic, lot coverage, or livability concerns should not really be voiced here because they're not the purview of this committee, but are instead the purview of the committees such as TRC, BZA, and City Hall. Our first agenda item for this evening is a 1-year extension.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, I think we have the minutes from.
Oh, yes, thank you. We first need to approve our meeting minutes from the January 24th meeting, which have been disseminated to the board both electronically and here tonight. Is there a motion to approve those minutes?
So made.
Is there a second?
Second.
Mr. Metters, Mr. Brown, how do you vote?
Yea in favor.
Mr. Metters,
Yea in favor.
Ms. Sobchak,
Yay.
Mr. White,
Yea in favor.
myself, yea in favor. The minutes are approved. So we'll move to agenda item B1, 102 President Street.
102 President Street is requesting a one-year extension on the vested right for the BAR final approval granted October 27th, 2021, based on the last governing body of TRC final approval on April 28th, 2022.
Very good.
Mr. Chairman, can I see a question? on
Sure,
that?
Ms. Metters.
It's based on the last governing body of TRC final approval. How is that tied into what we're doing?
We have received some additional clarification on that, as I understand from Corporation Counsel regarding the last entitlement that would trigger a review by this board. And so in that regard, it has been timely made. Or it is the opinion of council that has been timely made,
Got it.
not mine.
Thank you.
And so therefore, they've come to us to exercise that extension. And as a reminder to the public or anyone else who may not be familiar with this, this is really a ministerial act. This board does in fact have to vote to take the action. But we do need to vote on the record as a body. Okay?
And I do have a context
Oh,
comment.
oh, I'm sorry.
No, it's all right, it's on. So beginning with the date of review and approval from the last governing body, the applicant has an automatic 2-year vested right, period, followed by five 1-year extensions if submitted within the proper timeframes. This extension would expire on April 28th, 2025.
Move for
Very
approval.
good. Thank you. Motion to approve by Mr. Metters. Is there a second?
I'll second that.
Okay, Mr. Brown, how do you vote?
Yea in favor.
Mr. Metters,
Yea.
Ms. Sobchak, Mr. White,
Yea in favor.
and myself, yea in favor. Thank you, BD. For that clarification, that moves us to agenda item B2, 131 Columbus Street.
131 Columbus Street dates from 1970 in the old and historic district and is requesting demolition of existing building.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir.
uh,
You want me to use the standard formula on some of our more unfortunate buildings? Is there any member of the public here this evening who wishes to speak in opposition to the demolition of this structure? Just like we did for Tory, though, I'm going to let BD finish her context slides on this project. And I think we can vote for you.
Yeah, we have aerial, we have existing and context.
Okay,
And we did, I mean, we can go ahead and vote if you want, but we do have context and recommendation.
okay, please go ahead.
If you want to go ahead and, yeah, he's just gonna go through the whole. Okay, for context, the building is utilitarian in nature and has few, if any, historic architectural or aesthetic features. The nature and character of the immediate area is changing dramatically, and this building is increasingly out of place. While the building houses one of the few bowling alleys in the area, and especially in downtown Charleston, this cultural significance is not a particularly compelling reason for its retention. The building itself is not architecturally important to the city. Staff conditions, any architectural elements which might be salvaged for reuse should be. And staff recommendation is for final approval for demolition of the total building with board and staff conditions.
Thank you, BD, because you put in the work to do that, so we can at least do the staff presentation on these. Is there a motion regarding this application?
I'll move for final approval of demolition.
Very good. Is there a second? Okay, Mr. Brown,
Yea in favor.
Mr. Metters,
Yea.
Ms. Sobchak,
Yay.
Mr. White,
Yea in
and myself, yea in favor. Very good. Agenda item B2.
Okay, applicant is 205 Meeting Street. The structure dates from 1986 in the old and historic district. They're requesting preliminary approval for exterior alterations, majority of existing building to remain. The scope of this application includes, but not limited to, roof terrace, rooftop bar, and cupolas. So here's the area location. Existing site photos of the building itself. There's a couple of those, given the size of the building. And then the context within which the building sits.
Very good. We'll now hear from the applicant.
Good afternoon. My name is Keith Simmel with Cooper Carey Architects. We are working with LS3P on this project. You may recall, a little less than a year ago, we had a conceptual submission where we presented and were approved for some significant exterior changes to the Charleston Place Hotel. For this preliminary submission, we are asking for approval of some of those components, but not all of them. The owner has elected to move forward in a series of phases in order to disrupt the hotel's operation a little bit less than would have happened if we had done them all at once. Working with the contractor and the owner, we have developed a plan where we're going to do the exterior components, or would like to do the exterior components in 2 or 3 phases. So this is the first application for that. And they have the intent to do all of the changes that were approved on conceptual, just at a different timetable. So I think we can run through this pretty quickly. And I will skip, the context, the location of the hotel. In this plan, if you look through the package, we have surrounded the areas that are out of the scope that we're asking for in blue dashed lines. So specifically, we're asking for approval of the rooftop bar along King Street, and you can see it from the motor court arrival, and the addition of cupolas along the low-rise components of the building that face primarily Market Street. So here's a photograph of that rooftop area. This overlooks the motor court, and you can see it from some components of the right-of-way, but not all of them, but we wanted to include it in an abundance of caution. So we're proposing to demo that piece, which is the fitness center, and add a rooftop open-air bar. This is a rendering of what that would look like, surrounding some of the existing brick components with a treillage where we would like to encourage greenery to grow. This is that same component from the motor court area, and you will see that we're asking to demo the component above that area and replace it with this rooftop bar. These renderings show the removal of that horse statue and the recreation of that porte-cochere, but that will be in the next phase that we submit down the road with your permission. Here's that same rendering to show what it will look like with its landscape, so it's even further shielded from the pedestrian view. And then that same component, when seen from Meeting Street, where you can barely see this piece sticking up over the proposed greenery and new porte-cochere. Moving around to the rooftop component on the King Street side, this is the existing bar that sits there. We've got that octagonal skylight in the background, excuse me. And so we are asking for permission to develop this into a little bit more of an outdoor room where folks will feel comfortable and in a more shady environment to sit out there, enjoy a beverage and the views out over King Street. On the left-hand side, we are shielding the view to the rooftop over the ballroom. You may recall we had originally suggested creating a little bit sort of a kind of a fake meadow on that area. In further study, the structure won't support such a change. So we're using the greenery that's in this rendering to shield view to that. Here's a view down from King Street. I will also say, just as an aside, when we had originally rendered this out, we were suggesting the removal of the pyramid skylight. We've gone back and are keeping that, and you will see that in a future submission. But this is what that greenery would look like as you move up and down King Street. And then the same view from the corner of King and Market Street. Existing, and then off in the distance there, you can see what you would see up on that rooftop. Oh, excuse me. I'll also point out in these renderings, you can see the same part where we have these sort of truncated little hyphens on the existing low-rise portion of the hotel. And that is the other component that we're asking for approval, preliminary approval, which is the addition of the cupolas. So you can see here in the rendering, and you'll see some details at the end of this presentation. The rest of these renderings really just illustrate that component, the cupolas on top of those truncated hyphens. And everything else that's been dashed out in blue lines is we are hoping to defer to a future submission. I think I can move through the rest of these pretty quickly and get to some of the details. On the rooftop plan, you can see that we're asking to demolish the existing fitness center and the existing bar on the King Street wing of building. replace that with an open air bar and more of an outdoor terrace green room. Here's the rendered plan of that. Location of the bar on the top of the screen, and on the other side of that wall is the arrival porte cochere area. And to the lower part of your screen is King Street. Some lighting plans with some soft up lighting to create a kind of a glow at dusk and at nighttime. We don't think that will be too distracting from King Street, but it will add a nice feature for folks that are sitting out there in the evening. Some illustrations working with the landscape architect, Reese Roberts, who is assisting with the selection of greenery and the creation of the treillage along the existing brick walls on these elevations. Material selections, obviously it's an existing building, so we're trying to match the slate of the roofs for the cupolas and match the brick. And you'll see in just a moment that you will see some brick components where we're adding these cupolas. And we are attempting to match the existing brick, but keep in mind this exists, and we're still looking for the exact right match. This gets pretty close, but keep in mind the brick is 65 feet up in the air. And you will not be able to really get much closer than that to see it. And it will be shielded by a special shaped brick that you'll see in the section in just a minute. These are some of the before and after elevations that capture these components as you march around the building. And then these are the plans of the details. So this is the rooftop bar component, the treillage that gets attached to all the outside components, make it feel like a garden structure. Sitting up there on the roof, and in the reality of the situation, it will be largely shielded from the ground level view by greenery that will be added at the porte cochere area. Some of the details to tie in with the rest of the existing structure. And then here's the cupola. So on the backside, really the hotel guest from the high-rise portion of the tower is probably in the best position to see the brick from behind, but from the street level, you will really only see on the upper right-hand corner about 3 rows of brick before you get to the structure that has the slate that matches the existing slate, and then a small weather vane type finial that goes on top of each cupola. And here are some of the details with the special shaped brick that matches the water table brick on the lower portion of the low-rise building. And I believe that's it.
Very nice. Thank you. Any questions to the applicant from the board or staff at this particular time? I think we've got a
I
couple.
have one quickly, the letters screen on the
Yes.
rooftop, is that wood?
So we're looking at wood or metal. It will be painted in either case to give it sort of that garden feel. But we're working with the contractor to determine what's the most cost effective, but also the best material to put there for long term.
What matters.
It will have, one other thing, it will have the same profile, whether it's either wood or metal. The same, gridded at a 45-degree angle profile.
So keep that, I understood the phasing of the project to try to impact the business least. But why the phasing on the plans?
Why the phasing on the plans from an internal standpoint?
Just the presentation to the board, right? Because we're getting preliminary approval for some of it. What was in blue was not going to be evaluated today. What was in red is going to be evaluated today. Why the phasing of that?
I think, well, maybe a little bit confusing. We kept the plans in there to orient everybody within the building, but on the inside of the building, there's a lot of moving parts. We have to move, for example, the fitness center has to be moved and relocated temporarily in order to install this bar on the rooftop, if we're approved to do so. And then the fitness center moves again to its final location when the next thing's the spa slides into where the temporary fitness goes. So there's a lot of shuffling going on.
I got that, but Market Street,
Mhm.
the change on Market Street.
Yes.
And all of the other things that are identified in either blue or red, I can't remember, that are going to be on future submissions here to the board.
Yes.
The reason for delaying that is just, and not just having the complete set of plans.
So it's literally timing. It's in order to, we didn't want to go through and ask for approval and then not execute the approval that we get from the BAR. So The change, for example, along Market Street requires the closure of some of those retail components, the moving of some of those folks to a different area in order to demo those areas and open up the area that we're asking for on Market Street. So rather than create that sort of brain damage, quite frankly, with the contractor, the owner, and the architecture, we determined, and we did speak with previously with Tori and with Lawrence and with others, that this was the way to present this in not infinite number of bite-sized chunks, but a finite number, in fact, down to 3 components to get these approvals.
Thank you.
Further questions at this time? Seeing none, thank you. Any member of the public wishing to comment on this agenda item? Seeing none, city staff comments or recommendations?
Sure. Staff context, this phase of alterations is beyond simple repair and maintenance or minor revisions, which have been approved at staff level. Previous proposed work brought before the board has been revised due to scheduling concerns and is now becoming before the board in a couple of phases. It is noted that board and staff recommendation to leave the glass roof on the clock tower has been respected, and the roof terrace has been adjusted in minor ways and is minimally visible. Staff conditions, our applicant needs to ensure that the board understands the current proposed scope of work and how it will evolve into the next phase of work. Staff recommendation, approval of this phase of work with board and staff conditions, with final review of 4 permit drawings for this phase by staff.
Thank you. Any response from the applicant?
Nope.
Board discussion.
I'm not sure I 100% understand the purpose of phasing. A lot of times people will just get the whole thing approved and then just execute it in phases. But I mean, it could very well be because timing is an unknown, or, you know, got cost controls to consider, which are fair considerations. So I'm comfortable with this proposal, with this presentation. I think I know what we're looking at here and what we would be approving, so I'm comfortable with it.
And we also have, I too think that we could approve everything, and if the contractor the developer chooses to do it in phases, fine. I'm comfortable with the backstop of the conceptual approval we gave, which was pretty detailed, as being exactly that, a backstop, so that this doesn't end up being a value engineering exercise. So I thank you, and due to the level of detail, general improvement, which I'm pleased to see on this building, a building that would have benefited from this. When it was first constructed, this building was a moonshot, and what it was at the time was exceptional. And now, with the benefit of age, there are some improvements we can all generally agree on for an Empire style building, and these are appropriate phases. And I think what we've shown in conceptual approval regarding those facades will be taken care of, and I'm pleased to see the cupolas coming along. Further board comments? Yes, so I'm sorry.
Very quickly, I'm back to the trellis. Not trellis, the letters, screens. I think for the statue of this hotel itself, and the wood is not appropriate. Because it's more kind of low country, beachy, and longevity of the wood as well. So I want to make a comment to make sure that we will get appropriate material there, and metal probably the best.
Sounds like that would be incorporated in a motion approved by this board.
Yeah.
And I agree, just given the environment we're in, metal's probably the more practical consideration.
Yeah, but it doesn't even look right. You know, aesthetically, it's just not compelling of that statue to me.
Further board comments?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So keep that, I just want to make it clear to me what you were doing. I think about, in the staff recommendation at the end, final review for permit drawings for this phase by staff. And we all know that staff's time is valuable, and how many more of these applications, I like the plan. I mean, I think it's great. And I'm supportive. I'm thinking about the board and the work with the staff, and please be conscious of that as you continue to bring things through.
Thank you, Mr. Menders. Any other board comment? If none, a motion.
I'll introduce a motion for approval, well, what is this, preliminary approval of this phase of work, with board staff comments and final review for permit drawings by staff.
So the motion is for preliminary approval of this phase of the applicant's revisions, incorporating board staff comments and including final approval by staff for permit drawings. Is there a second to that motion? Okay, second from Ms. Sobчak. Mr. Brown, how do you vote?
Yay in favor.
Mr. Metters?
Yeah, in favor.
Ms. Sobчak?
Yeah, in favor.
Mr. White?
You in favor?
And myself, yea in favor. Thank you to the applicant.
Thank you very much.
Set it over here.
We're moving right along. Agenda item number 4, 860 Morrison Drive.
860 Morrison Drive is new construction in the historic corridor district. They are requesting conceptual approval for a 250 key 12-story Kimpton hotel with 16,000 square foot meeting and banquet areas, lobby level market bar, and 2-meal rooftop restaurant and bar with pool, and a 4-story mixed-use out parcel building. And here we can see the site off of Morrison Drive. Existing site photos, obviously it's currently a vacant site. Context on Morrison Drive. And then looking in the other direction on Morrison. Also, on this case, Johnson Street. And wanted to add that the context from Ravenel Bridge is also germane to this particular site.
Okay, very good. Mr. Bello for the applicant.
Happy Valentine's Day.
Yes.
And it's good to be here for BD's first meeting. It's very nice. Good honor.
Nothing says happy Valentine's like an administrative board meeting.
Exactly.
Oh, I thought you were gonna say like a model being
The only thing
presented.
holding you up from moving on to the next thing. All right, well, I'm Eddie Bello with Bello Garris Architects, and Brooke Taylor with PBS Design is here. I'm gonna walk you through the site approach that we took for this project. And then Brooke's gonna talk about the good stuff, the building designs and all that. So, and I'll try to be quick. We have a lot to go through, and I know y'all are ready, but we do have a lot. So we may go a little bit over the top. Next slide, please, Lawrence. I'm not even gonna try to quick. No chance. There's no historic context, as y'all know. This part of the peninsula was not developed historically. So next slide. And everybody's familiar with the site. A couple of key driving things for our design, and BD already mentioned it, is the overpass that's to the north. We've got an empty lot. This is a CPW lot that won't be developed. That will always be open. We're using that for parking. And then of course to the south, all of the first phases of Morrison Drive, of Morrison Yard. Next slide. Again, I think y'all are all pretty familiar with the context. Next slide. Next slide. And like has already been said, we did in our design spend a lot of time thinking about how this building will be experienced as you leave the peninsula on the overpass and as you come in to the peninsula, as well as, this building doesn't really have a back. And so we wanted to make sure we, next slide, please. Just some other site views. Next slide. Okay, so a couple of things about the site plan. So we brought a project before this board for this site and got conceptual approval a while ago. I want to say it's about a year ago. And there are some differences and some similarities. The biggest similarity is how we're approaching the site, where we have a shared drive for a northern building and a southern building. That's much more efficient than having 2 curb cuts. It's better for pedestrians and everything. But what's different is, and I don't want to compare too much from what we presented before, but what we had before was much greater, and a much greater density and a much greater height. If you remember, and then we got conceptual approval, but we had a building here that I want to say was 6 stories and then jumped up to 12 and then turned, and then we had another 12-story building here, and then we had a 9-story hotel. Now what we've done is shifted all of the height to this northern side. Then we have a 4-story office building. And this is our conference space, but this is much lower. So the overall height, scale, and mass is dramatically different. Another thing that we've had to deal with now is a much stricter flood requirement, LIMWA, which is limited wave action, moderate wave action. I always forget what it's called, but what that means is basically we now have to design this like it's in a VE flood zone. So VE means you can't have anything, very, very limited use within the flood zone. You can have lobbies, utilities, stairs, that kind of thing, but you can't have any active spaces. So in our prior project, we could have restaurants, other uses, and just floodproof. We got much lower and floodproof. Now we have to raise everything up. Everything has to be breakaway. So that's a design challenge. So next slide, and then Brooke, you get to talk.
Yep.
So what we did, we spent a lot of time, we need the buildings to be up on the street. We want a street edge, but how close they are is important. We don't want them too close, but we don't want a solid wall up on the street. So what we've done, we spent a lot of time sort of having these mid-level transitions from grade up to where we need to be. So we've got, and Brooke's got some great renderings, but we've got terraces and planters and certain things that activate that street, bring the people's faces down, so it's not a solid wall, and have it feel like a very active streetscape. And one last thing I was thinking about this today. It wasn't that long ago that this side of Morrison was just a curb and dirt and shrubs. And now with the first phases of Morrison Yard, it's really, really nice. You can walk there now. You couldn't walk there before. There's various outdoor spaces and terraces, a lot of stuff that Katie did, but it's a really, really exciting place now. And we're excited that this is sort of the next phase of that. That's it. So the next slide is auto circulation.
All right, appreciate it. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for being here. Yeah, what we're gonna do, we brought a model, so we'll take an opportunity to walk that around and talk about that as that relates to massing and the organization of elements on the site. So we want to walk you through that. But to pick up where Eddie left off, we want to talk more about the ground plane a little bit, and we're going to walk up through the plans. In some cases, we might have to run up through the plans, and we've got a pretty short amount of time. The slide you see here is specific, as you see, to the vehicular diagram. Eddie touched on kind of the circulation, the approach, the arrival from the Morrison Drive side. So you see by red arrow here, the circulation as you come in. You're coming in off of Morrison. You're looping around here. There's a drop-off moment here that allows you to get access to what is the jump lobby, which is on level 1. Again, having to move everybody up to level 2, which is an additional 12 to 13 feet above this level. It's a valet only option for the hotel. So the valet would loop into the lot, which is just to the north. I think it's the CWS lot, CPW, thank you. And then on return, come back, pick up here, and then you can make your way back out to Morrison. So if we go to the next slide, we'll see a loop. Whoops. No, that wasn't what I was thinking, but anyhow, that's okay. We're gonna go with it. This is fine. So what this does is gives you a south elevation of the hotel tower here. And this is essentially a section cutting through the center of that main access space, the plaza space. And then Eddie, as he pointed out, the idea is to have this movement, pedestrian movement and vehicular movement, both share this space here, which is the plaza space. And you see, as this begins to move up and over, you're moving up through a grand staircase into what is a pre-function space there, and we'll show you in plan how that begins to work. And eventually migrating all the way out to what would be a riverfront, waterfront terrace space. So that becomes part of the meeting space, part of the pre-function space. So you'll see how that begins to work and unfold in the plan. Next slide. Post site plan, I don't think we need to dwell on this. We can move to the next slide. All right, this is what I was expecting a minute ago. So again, parking and circulation. So as you come in from a hotel guest, your experience is you drive here, you drop off, valet takes your car, you park in the north lot. If you're an office user, you're predominantly coming in and utilizing this on-grade parking underneath what is the meeting and banquet space above. So this is primarily dedicated parking for the office user, the out parcel. It also provides support for back of house and other connections that we need to provide for both the hotel as well as for the meetings. Next slide. All right, so this is what we'll call, this is level 2, but it's really the primary level. Couple things that are really important, and Eddie touched on those a minute ago. Again, you see how these buildings, as they come out and engage Morrison Drive, there are terrace spaces here with steps and ramps and other elements that allow you to flow from Morrison Drive elevation to this elevated elevation here. So from left to right, we've got the bar market space that flows into the living room space. And the dominant element here, which is the hotel tower. This, as you see here, is the pre-function space. So you've got tall tower here on the north side. You've got a low mass here, which is the ballroom and meeting function. And then a small footprint here just to the south for out parcel future office space. Next slide. Level 3, this is more of amenities, back of house, support spaces for the hotel. You're beginning to see some green roofs appear here. You're looking down into what is the lower open to below space of the meeting and banquet mass. Next slide. All right, typical floor. So you're seeing kind of a fairly linear long building. We purposely situated it on the north side of the site for a lot of reasons. One primarily being the availability of natural light. Had we pushed this way, you're casting a lot of shade and shadow on the site. Keeping it on the north side of the site does a couple things. Allows more light into that space, connections through, but also kind of pulls it away from the existing phase 2 parking deck and the phase 2 office space. So it gives those things, those buildings room to breathe on that site. We'll see some other diagrams as well. This little bend at the end was really purposeful to think about adjusting that profile as you're viewing that end of what would be the east end of the hotel as you're approaching from Mount Pleasant. You get the building kind of reorienting its face, so you get kind of the narrow, slender face of that facade as you're approaching from the east. Next slide. So this is the top level. So you're seeing the only difference here is presidential suite on the end of the building. And we go up one more level. Next slide. Very good. At the very top, a couple things you see here. You see a restaurant bar rooftop with its terrace, a pool amenity space, and the building starts to push back at this level. So what that does is you come up the tower and you get to the top, it steps back a little bit. So it just takes some of the mass out of the building. This is the 12th floor. So it's not a short building, but it helps kind of slender the building up and then resolve itself at the top. All right, next slide. That's the roof. So we can just keep going. Next slide. Again, a couple things to note on here. Really, we've dashed in where the out parcel office building would be here. You can see that in red. In blue is the existing phase 2 parking deck, so you get an idea of the scale of that building behind this cut line. Next slide. All right. So as we started to think about this, and this will evolve into materials and ideas about how we thought about the approach to the building, some of the architectural elements, thinking about this sitting into the context of Charleston, South Carolina, you start to pull elements like you think about arrival and precedent, entries, stairs that allow you to flow up from what would be a public space to a more private space. So these are just representative examples of things that, as we thought about this project, start to find their way in as precedent for opportunities within the building. Next slide. Vertical proportions. You see that all over the city. It's something that as we get into the 3-dimensional views of the building, you begin to see those elements that we start to carry through, those vertical elements within the building that really accentuate that kind of fenestration within the building, feeling like something that fits within the context of Charleston. Next slide. Building materials and elements. Not to get too much into this, but you start to think about tones and textures, whether they be on building facades or whether it be on ground planes, or whether they be like tabby concrete, which is another material that's pretty prevalent throughout the city. On horizontal surfaces or even railings, where you start to think about the idea of creating a wall, but not a wall that has something that allows air and light through. So that's something else you'll see as we carry forward. Next slide. Some proposed elements, you begin to think about the building massing and the skin. You see the image on the left. Some deep kind of shadows, some relief in the building, texture again, both through shadow and material texture. You see some of the elements on the right, which might be more like representative of kind of wrought iron gates you see here in Charleston. But again, having things that help kind of create facades, but allow kind of air or movement through that. And we'll talk more about that, is how the building begins to meet the ground to obscure that ground floor elevated space. Next slide. Color palette. So looking through the color palette, pulling through some warm tones, elements that have texture, exposed concrete, reinforced concrete, brick pavers, tabby concrete again. And then, thinking about things like fig ivy, how do you begin to introduce some natural elements that soften that, or complement, but also soften some of the more exposed concretes or other elements. So it's pretty prevalent. So finding ways to weave that in as well. Next slide. All right, so mass and scale, streetscape, you see here, phase 2, multifamily on the far, phase 1 on the far right, office building, phase 2, and proposed hotel kind of in context. Next slide. All right, so a couple things to point out here. Clearly, this is the hotel mass here on the northern part of the site. This is the proposed out parcel office building. Just beyond that, you see the low roof form of the meeting and banquet space. And this your primary kind of pedestrian vehicular access point to the site. And out front here, you begin to see in that podium or plinth, you begin to see kind of what Eddie was talking about activating the edges and bringing people up from the street. Next slide. Down here at street level view, intersection of Stewart and Morrison. So what's important here, again, thinking about how we're addressing the street front, activating zones as you move up. So knowing that your first floor or second floor, most occupied floor is up here. So how do you begin to do that in a sensitive way that makes sense from the experience of the arrival experience? Building forms, you begin to look at some of the inherent kind of similarities between these from a massing and scale and a fenestration standpoint, but knowing that they're different. And that was on purpose. So you think of the hotel with its strong vertical collections of windows in this space. How do you begin to repeat that or recall that in the proposed office building in a sensitive way, but not mimic or make it identical to the hotel so it feels like a separate building, but actually works within the context of not only this building, but its neighbors. Next slide. View kind of moving back around, sort of looking straight down through what would be the arrival plaza here. I think the thing to really speak to about here, again, keeping this separation, which was a really strong design element in the previous concept. Wanted to make sure that came through in here and beginning to, again, kind of keep that minimum distance, knowing that we had requirements for vehicular access, emergency vehicle access, but also not ignoring the fact that it wants to feel like a pedestrian plaza at the same time. With a welcoming arrival here up through these steps into what is a pre-function and beyond out to the waterfront. Next slide. All right, a couple elevations here. I know it's hard to read, but starting to pull out some, or at least call out some of the materials on the facade. This is the Morrison Drive elevation of the hotel. We've turned off the office building here for this purpose. But again, really starting to pull out some strong verticals in the fenestration to really recall some of the things we talked about in the examples throughout Charleston. Next slide. Another diagram, again, just reinforcing the notion of circulation and movement through the space, knowing that this is being more of your let's call it public face, but also being able to connect up through it in the meeting and banquet space, and again out to the waterfront. Next slide. South elevation, you see a recall of some of the vertical elements that we talked about on the west facade. Also, you begin to see, as we spoke earlier about the mass of this, which is the meeting and banquet space, it's much lower. So again, think about the relationships of these buildings as they relate to what we're looking at here is the elevation of this in context with the hotel tower. So again, the density that Eddie talked about a minute ago, really bringing that density down, not overwhelming the site with too much mass and bulk. Next slide. All right, so down at the street level, this is a view looking north on Morrison. And in the foreground is the outdoor terrace here proposed in front of what would be the office building. So you're again seeing kind of a gradual elevation change to get up from the sidewalk up to what would be a terrace, and then around the corner back up to what would be the elevation that need to be above to meet the flood zone requirements. Beyond that, you're beginning to see a similar language over here on the hotel. Next slide. So this is looking the opposite direction. The hotel's in the foreground. Again, really reinforcing, creating soft boundaries here, but activating lift terraces as you go up. So it doesn't feel like an abrupt transition from here to what would be level 2. But again, activating that, having lots of opportunities for light into the market bar. And as you look further south, you begin to see the presence of the office building here in the distance. Next slide. All right, pulling back just slightly, you're across Morrison looking south. I think a lot of the same comments here. You're seeing kind of the way the building engages the street, where we're creating kind of a colonnade that wraps the corner, that becomes more of an expression of kind of piazza or entry. You're starting to see materials here where we're proposing some wood-like materials, but more likely metal, something I heard that comment just a minute ago in the previous presentation. So certainly thinking about the context of this building, where it sits, sensitivity to how do you get the durability out of materials. So you're beginning to see that here on this view. All right, I think as we go to the next one, we're going to pull back a little bit. All right, so this view is essentially eastbound on Highway 17. You see the Arthur Ravenel Bridge in the distance. So as we turn, this looking more at the north facade, I think what's important to take away here is to think about, and Eddie mentioned this, man, there's no back to this building, right? But this is, if there were a back, this has to be the back, because you start to get, again, you get screening elements down low that screen the parking and services. You get back of house components here that have to support the hotel. You get elevator cores, stair cores, other things. But we've talked about this on a couple of occasions. I feel like we've come a long way with this elevation. It's starting to feel, excuse me, it's starting to feel like the right balance of solid to void, where you have windows and openings in the facade. The other thing, I think there's just a strong kind of band of this horizontal, which wraps itself around the corner, stitches the base together. But as it gets closer to the street, it begins to feel more porous and open, more light filled, more open for activity. So it reveals that as you move further closer to the street. Next slide. This is that elevation on the north side. Again, specific on materials that we talked about earlier, beginning to get annotation in for that. So we start to get a feel for the composition of the facade. Next slide. All right, so view a little bit further back still. This is the on-ramp, Morrison Drive on-ramp. Again, heading back over the Cooper River to Mount Pleasant on your right. But this is a nice view, setting it in context. You see phase 2, its immediate neighbor. You see Highway 17 just off to the right. But again, the idea of kind of creating kind of a nice kind of rhythm of buildings here with a nice amount of space and distance between these, but also starting to engage the river side, if you will. We'll see, I think, in the next slide, it's another view. Oh, sorry, not quite yet. All right, this is the view approach coming in, heading west on Highway 17, incoming traffic lane. So you're beginning to see the hotel element here. Again, as we talked about a minute ago, having a little bend in the building, one to kind of take that facade and have that facade feel like it reorients itself slightly to the approaching traffic, but also to break down the monotony and the rhythm of that mass, because it's a 300-foot long building. So I think ways to begin to integrate subtle folds in the building so you can transition, I think is helpful in this composition. Next slide. All right, this is a little bit of a different view. It kind of pulls you out of the, what it looks like from the street, from the passerby. But this puts you down on what is the marsh side. So you see the rail tracks and existing tracks here. I think what's important to note is, again, kind of thinking about how does the building resolve itself on the on the waterfront side. How does that mass, again, that we talked about with its face facing back to Highway 17, how does that start to compose? Feel like creating activation zones that are not necessarily on the street to help, work within the building and support kind of the program, the meeting and bank. All right, east elevation, again, referring to materials and vertical proportions. Next slide. All right, this is an aerial view, Morrison in the foreground. Again, really kind of accentuating the ideas of kind of connectivity and openness here shared between these buildings, a distribution of mass on the site, activation on the street, and clarity about the separation between the two. I think what's reinforced in this image. Next slide. Okay, we're going to focus a little bit on the, talk a lot about the hotel. We'll talk a little bit about the out parcel office building here. So this is a view looking north on Morrison Drive. So what this building does is, again, all the things we talked about have been encouraging kind of activation zones underneath the building, allow the building to pull forward slightly, but also kind of angle back. And the reason for that is it allows that open feel as you're approaching north on Morrison. It tends to open itself up to the entry. So again, softening that kind of approach, both on foot or by vehicle. Next slide. You standing in the central courtyard looking south. Again, carrying that continuity you saw at the street and folding that into the interior courtyard to help activate this space as well. Noting also entry elements here to the hotel banquet and meeting space. Next slide. Just a view looking directly at the street activation here, retail inside. So again, you see kind of the movement into the space and up to the elevated active levels, again, to get the building up out of that required flood zone. Next slide. And the corresponding elevations for that, we can flip through these. Next slide. Again, you're seeing the recall of the vertical elements we talked about in the hotel, carrying those into this building as well. Next slide. Next slide. All right, so the dash line just indicates the existing parking deck that's located behind it now. So just to put that in context. Next slide. Streetscapes, pretty self-explanatory. Phase 3, the hotel on the left, you see gradual height from right to left, and then a gentle step back down as you get to the hotel. So slightly lower than the existing phase 2 office building today. Next slide. Elements and materials. I know we're getting into landscapes territory here. But again, this is the beginnings of a curated palette for the landscape. And I know as this evolves, we'll get more and more detailed and developed studies on the landscape, how to integrate some of the elements you're seeing here. Next slide. Same for plants and shrubs. So we'll see an evolution of that. We'll begin to get that layered into the planning. Right now it's more architectural, but begin to see where we'll soften some of the landscapes and curate that as we move forward. Next slide. I think it's the last one. This is the last one.
That's it.
All right. Yeah, I think we talked a lot about density and mass. Eddie's talked about the previous concept about how this is dramatically different, almost half what was on the site before. I think there's a really strong case about the organization of the parts and pieces to the site, how they complement the existing phases, how they respond to the street. I think there are a lot of positive things that we're continuing to work on, and we'll develop that. Certainly thinking about fenestration, getting the depth and richness in that facade or facades is a critical part of our approach. We're excited about it. We're looking forward to it. So appreciate y'all's time. Anything you want to add?
No, that was good. I know y'all are ready. I think he said everything needs to be said. Again, we're super excited to be at this stage finally. It's been a lot of work. We're just looking forward to hearing your comments.
Very good. Any questions from the board at this particular time?
I just one, so this is Upper Peninsula zoning, and I guess you're getting consideration for creating this open space in the middle of the composition. Is there any expectation by the city that provides public access to the river or views to the river?
No, we're not. We are in Upper Peninsula zoning, which some of y'all know, we have a point system to be allowed to go to the height. By the way, that ground floor counts as a story, even though we're not using it. It's up, so it's an 11-story building that counts as 12. We're not using that public space as part of our point system. We're using Charleston rises. We've got the green roofs. We've got some solar panels. We've got some other things, but the public space is not part of it.
Okay.
I think that railroad is interrupting so much that it's hard.
Other questions at this time? Here none. Thank you to the applicants. Are there members of the public wishing to speak on this agenda item? Preservation Society.
Good evening, Erin Mahard, Preservation Society of Charleston. The Preservation Society appreciates the applicant meeting with us to walk us through the design. For the record, we have no issues with the building this large at this location, which will block important view sheds, loom over the adjacent neighborhood context, and intensify development of vulnerable low-lying land. Unfortunately, zoning entitlements have been granted that allow a building of this size backing the BAR into a corner, with little wiggle room to reduce its impact. Since we're here to only look at architecture, we will say that this project is starting off in a strong place. We particularly appreciate the reduction of massing on the site from the previous proposal and feel the narrow proportions and simple repetitive design are effective. As the project progresses, we have a few recommended areas for continued study. First, an aspect of the previous design that we appreciated was the terrace feature and openness through the middle of the site. Creating more green space and better view sheds and access to the water should be explored on the site plan. Next, perhaps best seen in the rendering on page 35, the angle of the hotel facade to align with the street has an awkward relationship to the smaller office building that is squared off. The two planes should be unified to better relate as part of the same development, and squaring off the hotel facade may work best. Also, the large rectangles created by the projecting frame on the hotel's upper facade causes the building to feel overscaled. Incorporating more distinct divisions within the frames could help reduce the visual scale of the building. Next, the flat roof extending forward over the second floor of the hotel feels overly heavy as seen on page 28. The footprint of the projecting element should be shortened, and the columns could be reduced in size and in number to help this important part of the building feel more human scale. Also, we are concerned about the raw look of the exposed concrete and feel a higher quality material and finish should be considered here. Finally, looking particularly at pages 36, 38, and 39, the flat roof at the top of the building is very prominent and draws too much attention to itself. Either the roof cantilever should be minimized, or a more interesting treatment should be studied to enliven this building's contribution to our skyline. So while we strongly feel development of this intensity should not be built here, the design largely meets the principles for new construction, and therefore we are comfortable with it moving forward within the existing process. However, we urge the board to incorporate specific conditions for continued study and refinement of the points mentioned. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hart. Any other members of the public wishing to be heard? Hearing none, city staff comments, recommendations.
Our first context comment, I think Eddie Bellows primarily addressed, which was to have the applicant explain how Limois and other parameters have changed the project from its previous conceptual design. Staff appreciates the design response to the coastal A flood zone requirement as manifest on Morrison Drive side of the building at ground level. The elements are well thought out and promote a lively urban space. Staff also commends the design of the elevations at base level of the site, particularly the integration of landscape. Above the base, the north, east, and west elevations of the hotel are developing good visual interest. Staff conditions. Staff supports the idea of the shared street concept in between the two buildings, but would prefer a less car-oriented design. Staff recommends revising the detailing of the shared street to include additional landscape, hardscape, and/or street furniture details, which can emphasize the shared notion of the street beyond the automobile. The shared street terminates in building fabric and not in the harbor bridge experience as the diagram on A31 shows. Thus, the diagram's indication that there is a direct connection between Morrison Drive via the shared street to the harbor does not exist in the project as shown. Staff supports the intent of the diagram and recommends the pre-function space at the top of the stairs be minimized visually and materially or even opened up as outdoor space. The south facade of the hotel appears more repetitive and is not as rich compositionally and requires further study to achieve a stronger elevation design above the base. Finally, the design of the elevation of the mixed-use building to the south of the site does not integrate as well to the base design. Staff recommends further study to unify the design of the mixed-use building in terms of the elevation. Staff recommendation is approval with staff and board conditions.
Thank you, BD. Any response from the applicant?
Yes, so I guess we'll start with, not gonna go by point. I think all the comments were reasonable. I do want, so just talking about yours really quickly. Definitely makes sense to try to incorporate more landscaping in the drive. I think the idea of trying to minimize that pre-function space is even more transparent. We've got to study that because we do need to connect, but maybe there's ways to make that a little less building and more open. So I think that's all good. I think the one thing that we probably disagree with, respectfully, is the direction of the office building. Lawrence, can you just put up any of the renderings, the last one maybe? One of the things we thought about, because one original scheme for this looked a lot like the hotel. It kind of matched. And we went away from that right away because one, we don't think they should match. They should be complementary. And so maybe there's things we can do to tie them in a little better. So I think that's a good thought, but we don't want them to match. When the proportions aren't the same, the uses aren't the same. And also, if it's another one of these, it's going to feel bigger on the site. We think it'll feel more massive. Also, if you think about how Morrison Yard has gone, it's very diverse. There's a lot of play with shapes and, you know, colors and materials, and it all kind of worked. And I don't think that this was bright red, be the same, but so we would say on that one, I don't know that we want to change the direction. Maybe there's another way to tie it in more.
Yeah.
Of course, the ground plane ties in. We've got the same columns. We've got the same three.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Can I clarify that? Because when
Yeah.
we're saying unify, we're not saying unify the site. We're saying unify that building with its base.
Oh, with its base.
Yeah,
Okay,
that's what
okay.
we're saying. It's right now, it
Let's
feels like it just sits on the PLOT like it's been
Well,
dropped
that's
on.
such a good answer for what I
Yeah.
thought was. your-
Yeah, no, we unified that.
Sorry. Okay,
discrete
that makes
building.
perfect sense. It does
Yeah.
feel a little disconnected.
Yeah.
Okay, so
Yeah.
yeah, that's, yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Next level makes
Yeah.
sense. And then to respond to Preservation Society, again, thank you, Aaron. Those are always good comments. The good news is, I know you don't like the zoning, but at least it's less than it was. There's that. I think, one of the things she taught about that I think is really the only thing that's affecting us much is the angle of the buildings. And if you look at the model, this is not an excuse, but I think a lot of times the renderings tend to exaggerate the viewpoint a little bit. That was also intentional. You know, we pushed this building way back. The building used to be up here. We could put it up here. That was intentional, but it does have an angle that comes out, and that is to respond to the edge of the street. But also to give a little bit of play. You know, we want it to be somewhat dynamic. We don't want this to feel heavy and static. And I think if you look at the model, I think it doesn't feel very severe, that angle. So I think our response to that is we're certainly open to studying, but I don't know that it needs to be a lot. definitely the windows. We talked about this. Again, we want this to be layered. We don't want this to feel like a hole with something on the side. The other comments, I think they all, things we were happy to study. We want something, you know, we don't want the front to be too light. You know, we want heavy columns up there. It's basically just an open pavilion, but we want a heavy, you know, street edge. We want all that street edge. But no, this is conceptual, so we're happy to keep studying this. So I don't know.
No, I think you covered it. And I think, appreciate all the comments. And yes, like you said, I think further studies required, and we continue to do that. So, and I appreciate it. Thanks for your time.
Board discussion and a vote.
Well, I'll lead it off. I think that the massing and the proportions of this composition are really compelling. And the streetscape, even as it's configured now, with the angular forms, is really pretty promising, because, you know, you're dealing with quite a difference from the street to the first occupied floor. And this has the potential of being far more promising than, say, West Edge. I'm staring at the side of the Publix. But because the form is so expressive, I don't think the fenestration has to be. I think, and I think several comments are sort of pointing at that. You could simplify and calm the fenestration, especially on the hotel tower itself. The material palette, especially for the office building, seems to veer a little dark, especially considering who your neighbor is. And I think probably the one thing that's the most unfortunate about the presentation is how much time you spent diagramming a relationship that doesn't actually exist. And that's why I asked the question, is there an expectation that the public would have access to an elevated view of the river from here? No, I think that's a missed opportunity, but I understand the programmatic limitations of needing to pre-function somewhere. If ever it was possible to have that as outdoor space, that would be ideal for this composition and really ideal for the street. And other than that, I agree with staff comments.
I was gonna say that I think that so height, scale, and mass, I think the composition of the office building is nice. And that it has a great relationship to the street. And I'm more comfortable actually with it being squared off in the manner that it is, or the form of the building being square. I think, considering the various elevations, the terraced approach, the step back approach, the as soft as you can get it approach on a major thoroughfare like Morrison Drive is all very thoughtful. And I think if you're driving by, hopefully walking by, this is actually a really successful presentation. So I think the setback, the fact that the hotel's not pulled up to the Morrison Drive curve are all helpful. I don't think that the hotel tower massing is inappropriate. I don't have a problem with that as a configuration, but I'll tell you this. Unfortunately, you well, maybe it shouldn't be unfortunately, take this up as an opportunity. You have the golden ticket on the building that is one of these marquee entries to Charleston. And because of that, as Jay White has said, I think the fenestration on the tower, not the lower elements, that prominent coming across the Ravenel Bridge needs to be refined and less fussy without being bland, and have some strong classical elements, including what we do here in Charleston in terms of having a strong cap. And the reason I think that is some of the other elements that you see from the Ravenel Bridge, neighbors to this from the Ravenel Bridge, have been unfortunate, and we get a lot of commentary about them. And so I think this is the last best shot to get that viewscape taken care of and have a really nice piece of architecture. And I know your firm can do that. So the massing of the tower is correct, right? And I don't have a problem with the orientation of it. What I would like to see is a very thoughtful, refined approach to all the fenestration, so that when people are piling by it every day, they all agree that it is not just a nice piece of architecture, but really an exemplary piece of architecture based on the location. I have no problem with the Morrison Drive approaches or the massing of the office building. The tower mass is fine, but I think even at this level, we need to have a pretty robust discussion about what the fenestration looks like on those elevations that present to the river. on the tower at least. The river terrace below is fine as well.
Would anything-
Yeah, so, I don't want to repeat anything with Jay and Mr. Robinson that just said, but but again, I think the message is, working well here and reducing the scale of what we had seen before is commendable. I think it's kind of contemplating some of the comments from preservation comments. I actually think that breaking and turning this building helps the message, but also it addresses the approach from the driving on 17. And I think on that end, you have balconies and things like that, so it's nicely breaking that part of the building, and it's kind of more residential on that side. The roof on the top, I think it's the right size to me. It's sort of nautical, and we are on the water, and the flying roof is nicely addresses that. The Morrison side, the colonnade and that entrance and all that, it kind of presents opportunities, saying it's not just hotel, but it's a civic building with, grandeur of this entrance. The office building, I'm looking back and forth, it's sort of pinching on the existing building now a lot. And I understand that it's maybe creating the continuity of this already broken down elevation, but how it's treated, how it's treated with all that glass is just not doing that yet. That's just how I see it in model as well. And I know it's garage, so, okay, but how do you create this streetscape, and how do you feel that between your proposed building and existing building and ground level is, I don't think it's connected well yet. Going back to wood. I was opposing the lattice design more than anything. So wood is appropriate, and correct wood is appropriate. I can do that. I'm done. I just wish that there will be actually continuity, connectivity to the work somehow, for kind of more like we have on waterfront with aquarium and things like that.
I think about this building. Its significance due to it's on this primary interest coming into the city. I like standing on Morrison Drive, looking at the west facades. I like the way that you've terraced things in there, and the comments that were made by staff, I get it. And the integration with what I call the transformer building into these adjacent buildings, I think from a height scale and mass, it feels good. But it's general architectural direction that's giving me a hang up on primarily the north side, to some degree the south side, because of just the repetition that's seen. And I've heard that it's kind of a minimal representation or repetition. To me, it's I hope that there's another way to present that side, especially this side coming in the north side, and whether or not that influences the south side. I don't know, but I appreciate the effort that's gone into making this tie together. I'm standing on Morrison Drive, looking at the west elevations. I like, I mean, some of it's very strong. Some of it, to me, almost felt like, hey, this might not really go together, but then I kind of liked it. And I looked at it for a long time, and then Lawrence, can you go to page, let's see where. $50. What I wrote down, so I could be wrong.
What page is the key? Yeah. Page 50.
Yeah, page 50 is, this is taking.
It was like a streetscape.
Looking
Darkened out,
Yeah, this is the north side.
so you're pretty much looking west or northwest.
It's either.
No, it's a streetscape view, so I think it's the one as you're coming underneath the overpass going south.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just a simple streetscape. You're on Morrison Drive.
One more back,
Just-
just that one, right?
That one?
No, it's not a rendering or a drawing. It's,
Oh, it's a streetscape drawing.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
and I had written
That's
down
towards
page
the end
50.
of the set.
Lawrence, I think it's toward the end.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm looking at these bottom numbers down here.
Oh.
Yeah, page 50, so that's.
This one?
Yeah. So when you're talking about just, high scale massing, look at, you can see it. Then again, I'm gonna call it again because I just find it interesting with the legs coming down. It's tough when you gotta transform from that building, which I call a transformer because that's what it looks like, over to your building. And what I see though is in that general architectural direction, specifically on the north side. And then again, how it might influence the south side. I mean, I'd like to see that and what other ideas may be before giving approval at this level. And, but I want you to hear me say how wonderful I think so many other aspects of the project are. And I appreciate it.
Further board comments?
When looking at high scale mass architectural direction, I think that, as Mr. White mentioned to me before the meeting, I'm somewhat predictable. If not consistent on a lot of what I share. And what's funny is I think that Mr. Bello convinced me in the last conceptual review of the building last year. He got me on the bandwagon, and seeing this project has reminded me that I think I was right. So the height should have more of a step down into the north side to the interstate or onto Highway 17, excuse me. The scaling is not right for Charleston. It might be okay for the neighborhood, but it removes the pedestrian side of it. I honestly, driving up Morrison would replace it for driving up Peachtree in Atlanta. That's the feeling that I get from the renderings that are presented. In the general architectural direction, I think that there's an opportunity here where you would be able to achieve all of the goals of the programming and the use that you would want by bringing the project as a whole lower in height, still working under the same flood guidelines, but in a different architectural direction, simply by looking at these buildings right here, because they are all considerably different in their architectural style. And so something that would be a complete 180 in the traditional or classical style might be more appropriate here, even though you don't get the sight line into the waterway. There's an opportunity. I mean, I look at the Reed House in Chattanooga or the old Orquithor Hotel in Brunswick, Georgia, but I think that there's an opportunity to do something completely different here that still flows architecturally with this grouping of buildings. The north side is honestly to me the most concerning because of that long sight line coming on and off the bridge. We'll leave it at that.
Further board discussion.
So, as for me, I don't know that, I mean, there's been a lot of conversation about the fenestration of the hotel tower specifically. And my hunch is that the design team is probably just one or two iterations away from getting it where I would be a lot more satisfied with it. I'm not sure that it's so far off the mark that alone it warrants a deferral. However, I'll say that we don't do it much anymore, but we once did split motions where we did a by scale and mass, but defer general architectural direction based off the commentary. I don't know how comfortable staff is with that because we've gotten away from that habit. We sort of stopped doing that during the pandemic. It just helps in such a situation. It helps the applicant understand, okay, what's still under consideration. As some aspects of this is deferred, what is that aspect? But I don't know if that's palatable to anyone. I mean, if I were going to make a motion, I would probably make it for conceptual approval with board and staff comments, because I think it was fairly consistent about where people felt the problem areas were. Mr. Brown's commentary was not addressed by that. But I don't know, any thoughts or opinions?
I think the height is right. And two reasons for me. First of all, it balances this finally out in its own. But also, if we, if it lower it, doesn't become this kind of gateway building which you see from 17 anymore. So it's and there is good reason I think to see it and create that flow with the 17 demonstrations. I don't think it's strong enough to give a reason to defer because it's elements, and yes, it's part of the architectural direction, but it can be worked out in the next level.
So I'll just weigh in since we're all weighing in again. I'm not a fan of splitting motions, but also, Mr. Chairman, you and I have had conversations about general architecture direction. There's I mean, what does that mean? And how do you define it? And we're still following that general architectural direction. I think everybody on this board has had a comment about demonstrations. So I'm not sure I understand why we would move it forward without just, if they're that close, then let's just see it. And that's just not.
We talked about fenestration and cap. Some of my broader remarks were about how this is whether one wants it to be or not, it's a marquee building. Which in fairness to Mr. Bella means I'm on the bubble about a deferral, because I have no doubt with the strength of his design team, whether it's a deferral or we load up a conceptual review with all these comments, what he comes back with would be reflective of that. But it's in my view, for the reasons stated, it's not just a hotel project.
I would agree with that. And I would say that if this is not just a hotel project, then we should allow for more time to get it right.
Yeah, with all the commentary on what I think is right about it and what I'm not hearing issues with. Particularly in terms of the office space, I'm not hearing a ton on Morrison other than people wondering if there should be more step down, but that given this particular the difficulty of Morrison Drive being a relatively narrow, heavy traffic corridor, I think it's one of the more sympathetic treatments for pedestrians again. I think what I'm hearing is a lot of commentary about what you're going to see on the bridge and the highway, and this being the last building on that road, and how much it should complement its very large neighbor versus, somehow being a step down from it. In some ways, I think it can have the effect of ameliorating its neighbor if done correctly.
Do we have a perspective looking from the bridge?
Looking from the building to the south. Yeah,
No, from the, I guess, north from the bridge.
yep, it was,
Coming in.
Yeah, like when the coming into town, yeah.
39 Lawrence. It is almost at the building rather than further back under the,
This?
no,
Do that.
no, that one.
that one. Yep.
But that's you're almost parallel with the
Oh,
building.
that's
at
so
that point.
low then.
Well, although, some may take umbrage, but I will actually introduce a motion. I'm going to do a motion for deferral, not on height, scale, and mass, but on general architectural direction for the reasons recited by the board. For the reasons incorporate, let me clean up my motion. A motion for deferral on general architectural direction, incorporating board comments.
I'll second that.
I know I'm not supposed to speak. Can y'all clarify? Because this direction was very different from the rest of the boards. I know, but just so we know, I'm a little confused. Administration's one thing, but general architectural direction.
Mr. Chairman. Sorry.
I know it's just.
Okay, hold on, because Mr. Metters may address that, what he was going to
Yeah,
say.
this confusion right here, which is real, and I get it, is why I think we shouldn't split the motion.
Should not. Okay,
That's just for that exact reason.
then I'll withdraw my motion.
I'll make a motion for deferral with board and staff comments.
Okay, the motion is for deferral, incorporating board staff comments. Is there a second?
I'll second that one. Get it
The
rolling.
motion is in proper order. Mr. Brown, how do you vote?
Yay in favor.
Mr. Metters?
Yay.
Ms. Sobchak?
Nay, in favor, not in favor.
Mr. White?
Yeah, in favor.
And myself, yay in favor. The vote is 4-1, and so it is deferred for the reasons stated. We look forward to working with the applicant to address those issues on direction, including getting you a transcript of these comments.
I'm very confused. Really am. Not complaining, it's fine. None of our architectural direction is what Stephen was talking about. Being the administration. I am confused.
Okay,
We'll just read this and figure it out. Thank you.
we look forward to working with them.
This one.
That's